case for a normative theory of educational leadership. And you're in for a treat. Those people who are missing this are going to miss the opportunity to hear an absolutely distinguished scholar who started out as a scholar and then became a scholar administrator. She ran the College of Education for 7 years. Now she's back as a scholar. She has taught high school for 90 years and before completing a doctorate at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And since then, she has, at 4 different universities, she has taught classes and conducted research intended to focus on the creation of inclusive, equitable, excellent, and socially just learning environments. That's the kind of advocacy scholarship that thrills me to the bone, because that's a way of making education work for people. This work includes the operationalization of the theory of transformative leadership, as well as 12 books, over 100 articles and chapters, and numerous international keynote addresses in Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and North America. She has received international recognition for this work, including an honorary doctorate from Laval University in Quebec in the summer of 2017. And that year, she also received the recipient of the Harold Campbell Lifetime Achievement Award from the University Council for Education Administration in Denver. As you would expect, as a full professor in a prestigious university, she is very well published. Just mention a couple of her publications. One publication that came out in this summer, Becoming a Transformative Leader, a Guide to Creating Equitable Schools, from Rutledge. In 2016, she published Transformative Leadership, a Primer, from Peter Lang. And in 2012, she published Transformative Leadership in Education, Equitable Change in an Uncertain and Complex World, again through Rutledge, New York. In 2008, she published Democratization Practices, Courageous Leadership for Transforming Schools, Christopher Gordon publisher, and then she has a primer on Bakhtin, published in 2007, and she has co-authored dozens and dozens of publications, and published a number of manuscripts and articles. So you're in the presence of a very active scholar who has continued to provide leadership in the area of transformation. She is also a member of the Center's Advisory Board. In that capacity, she is one of my bosses, and she has served with other distinctions. So far, this is her final year of service, and I would not be unhappy if she is appointed to serve again. But that's a decision that her dean has to make. So I welcome you to the talk, and she will talk to you about a case for a normative theory of educational leadership. So please welcome to the virtual podium Professor Carl. This means an actual podium I can run and get
I
one.
do not, and thank you all for coming. I think I better make sure that we're all on the same page with what I mean by a normative theory. A normative theory is concerned with values, it's concerned with a vision, a desirable vision of the future and what ought to be, as opposed to an empirical theory which really describes what is. And my approach is that we have a need for a theory that promotes educational environments that are equitable, inclusive, excellent, and socially just. And the theory, as Walter said, that I particularly focus on is transformative leadership, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go through the talk. I think we need a normative theory. When I look around the world, I look at education in America, and I see that in 2012, the high school graduation rates were obviously inequitable, with fewer African Americans and American Indians than white and Hispanic students graduating from high school. We know that less than 50% of students who start university finish. We know that in Detroit, for example, even though the Detroit Public School Community District is arguing that it has shown improvement in the last couple of years, the third grade results in English language arts are that almost 12% are meeting standards. Fifth grade, 14% are meeting standards. Seventh grade, 13%, and you can see the math standards. And yet we have a 79% graduation rate. There's something that seems to me to be inherently wrong with that. And that's, of course, explained by the achievement gap, which is really better called an opportunity gap or an empowerment gap, to put the onus on those of us who should be empowering students as opposed to blaming students. When I look around at the wider social context, I also see disparities, and I could spend all day and the whole of this talk talking about the disparities. Yesterday, I heard that an African American college graduate makes less than a white high school graduate on average in this country, for example. And the disparities go on and on. At Wayne State, nothing's very different. Many of you know that Wayne State has not had a good record with graduating underrepresented or minoritized students. Currently, the 6-year graduation rate for undergraduates is 45% overall and 26% for African Americans. And so my question really is, how do leadership theories respond to and help to redress these inequities? And my argument, of course, is that they should. Not everybody would agree with me. And I think to begin to think about how this happens or why it doesn't happen, we need to know a little bit about the history of educational administration or leadership as an academic discipline. In the 20th century, as those of you who are my students, and that's many of you know, scientific management began in about 1911 with Frederick Taylor's work in bricklaying and shoveling. Gilbreth, Fayol talked about management theory and a focus on chains of command and order and hierarchies. And that led, in 1957, to a group of educational leaders, mostly from universities, going by train to Chicago to a conference called Administrative Theory in Education. And at that conference, their goal was to enhance educational administration and leadership as an academic discipline. And in order to do that, then, they developed what has become known as the theory movement, in which people argued that ought questions, normative questions then, have no place in a science or in education. And so the whole emphasis in a lot of the research through the 20th century was an emphasis on describing what is, how do organizations operate, what do leaders do. That continued right up into this century, as is evidenced by the publication Scientific Research in Education by the National Research Council, in which, as many of you know, they argued that the gold standard for research is replicable empirical studies. And a couple of years later, the National Council for Teacher Accreditation, Teacher Program Education Accreditation, rejected an attempt to include social justice as one of their standards and called it a cruel hoax on impoverished kids. That was the phrase, a cruel hoax on impoverished kids. At the same time, though, as is evident by the formation of AERA's Special Interest Group on Social Justice in 2006, there was a counter movement to try and argue for something normative and something that focused on social justice. I indicated in the blurb for this talk that I was going to share with you a little bit about how my own personal trajectory intersects with these theories and these approaches to leadership. I started longer ago than I want to acknowledge as a K-12 educator, and very quickly met some students who taught me how important relationships were. I remember my first year of teaching 7th grade French. Sonny was a student who sat in the back of my French class, slouched over, his hair all over his face, silent, never doing his homework, never lifting a pen in class. You all know the kind of student. I argued with him. I threatened him. I begged him. I ignored him. I gave him detentions. And finally one day I said, fine, if you won't study in class, you have to come and we'll do French at my house after school. And to my surprise, he came. And as we were sitting at my dining room table, conjugating avoir and être, Sonny suddenly said, I just found out my mother was married Saturday. And gradually he told me his story. He had lived with his mother and a younger brother in a house in Labrador in the middle of a Labrador winter. His mother became involved with a man who disliked Sonny and sent him to live in an unheated shed with no electricity attached to the house. Social services had found him, brought him down to the dormitory in the community where I lived, and hence he was in my 7th grade class. The more I got to know Sonny, the more he told me about his story, the more he trusted me, the more he actually did his homework. He never became a star in 7th grade French, but he actually passed that year. Subsequently, as I was teaching high school in Saskatchewan, I was involved in teaching in a gifted program. And at the end of the year, as I often do, I gave the students donut holes as awards. And as I gave them awards for being the best gum chewer in the class and having the most academic achievement or the most absences or whatever, some were serious and some were humorous, the students said to me, may we give acceptance speeches? And so as they gave acceptance speeches, they talked about how in their previous schools they'd been so isolated and they'd had nobody they could talk to about the books they were reading, about the things that interested them. And again, the importance of relationships was brought home to me. When I moved into higher education, then my first research studies were studies of gifted programs. Kids who were identified as high achieving or gifted and were isolated in their small home schools, and what difference it made when they were brought together in classrooms. And again, I learned about the need for academic challenge and a respectful peer group. I then moved to the University of Utah, where I was involved for a number of years in both consulting and research and professional development on the Navajo Reservation. And as the blurb recounts, I remember a series of interviews when I was talking to teachers about what would help these students to perform better. Now this was a well-equipped school. It had an auto shop and a wonderful computer labs in the 90s and every piece of equipment you would want. It wasn't a failure of students because of a lack of resources. And one of the teachers, when I said what would help these students to achieve, responded, better parents. I've had a similar kind of conversation with people in Detroit. A former neighbor, when talking about education, said to me, well, the only way to help students in Detroit improve is to build boarding schools. And so I learned very quickly about the need to eliminate deficit thinking and stop blaming the students. My third series of studies seems to be totally detached from the previous studies because I was looking at structures, the notion of year-round schooling, or what we sometimes call balanced calendar. And I did that because after being in Utah, where people tended to have large families and schools were overcrowded, I moved to British Columbia. British Columbia was beginning to look at balanced calendars at that time, and so because I'd been in Utah, I became an immediate expert. I knew nothing about it and decided I'd better study it. My studies of year-round schooling intrigued me, and I kept doing it because I realized it was an equity issue. And I learned about the ability of structures and cultures to address student need, and particularly about summer learning loss, about which there's probably more consensus than about most educational research topics. Researchers have found that advantaged kids from advantaged families during the school year learn approximately 18 months worth of whatever the subject matter is. Over the summer, as they travel with their families, the families have enough resources to enroll them in summer programs or camps. They gain another 3 to 4 months for a net gain of 16 to 17 months worth of learning in an academic year. Kids from disadvantaged families are just as smart. They gain approximately 12 months worth of learning during the school year. But over the summer, as they often are relegated to an apartment, to looking after a sibling, parents can't afford to enroll them in activities or take them places, they tend to lose 3 to 4 months worth of learning for a net gain of 8 to 9 months, which of course compounds year after year after year. Hence the importance of paying attention to structure as well as to culture and individuals. And while I was doing these studies, I found myself in departments and working with academic colleagues who told me that social justice was not important and that it was fringe to educational administration and leadership. And as you can see, I rejected their ideas and I continued to examine the notion of social justice and leadership and the need then for leadership theory that focuses on equity and those kinds of values. And very soon, at the end of the 1990s, everybody was using the term social justice and social justice leadership. And as I've said very recently to some of you here in class, it meant everything and nothing. And the example I tend to use is the example of the need to build, the desire to build a wall on the American southern border. You can argue for the wall in the name of social justice. You could say, but it's just to protect people from invaders, from those who bring in drugs or who are going to be rapists or who take our jobs, right? You can make, and people do make that argument. And you can certainly argue against it in the name of social justice, saying that everybody deserves a safe place to live and a haven from terror or poverty or violence in their home country. And so I, at that point, decided that what we needed, instead of focusing just on the idea of social justice in education, was a much more robust theory of educational leadership. And of course I had to begin to ask myself, does theory even matter? I referred briefly a few minutes ago to scientific management, to Taylorism, and many of you know that Taylor talked about how workers were too stupid to understand the task at hand. It's the bosses who could tell them how to do it well. That is still evident in education today in terms of teacher-proof curriculum, providing teachers with scripts because they're not smart enough to think about writing prompts or scripts for their students that are relevant to a particular group of students. The way we evaluate teaching often is a checklist, as if every class should be taught in exactly the same way with the same resources. Scientific management is still very prominent. But then in 1974, T-Bar Greenfield gave a paper at a conference in Bristol that broke the field wide open because he said organizations were cultural artifacts and we needed to pay attention to the people in them and their lived realities. And that started what's been known as the paradigm wars in education, or sometimes the Greenfield-Griffiths debates. From that period then emerged a whole lot of new theories, a lot of debates about what constitutes appropriate leadership, appropriate study of educational leadership. And many of those theories drew on Bill Foster's notion that educational leadership must be critically educative, that it shouldn't just look at the conditions in which we live, but it must also decide how to change them. And so I took that admonition seriously and turned ultimately to James McGregor Burns' 1978 book simply called Leadership. And many of you know, but in this book he talked about two distinct forms of leadership. He talked about transactional leadership. And you all know what a transaction is. You go into a store and you buy something and you give them money and they give you the item. Or if you're being a transactional leader, and a teacher wants to teach a particular AP class of students, you say, I'll give you this class, but I need you to support my discipline policy or no hat policy or whatever. And so you engage in a transaction. He also talked about transforming leadership. And this is where it gets interesting, because transforming leadership has given rise to two distinct theories. The two words transformational and transformative in a dictionary tend to be pretty similar. But in theory, they're very distinct. Transformational leadership focuses on four processes. The first is setting direction, managing the instructional program, developing people, and I never remember the fourth. But the key to transformational leadership is that it doesn't tell you what direction, what kind of process. So you can develop people the way Mayo did in the Hawthorne Electric Company experiments. You can develop people or set directions according to scientific management and make every teacher be on the same page at the same day, right? Or you can do something very different and much more equitable, at least in my opinion. Transformative leadership, and we'll talk a bit more about it in the next few minutes before we open this for discussion and questions, is grounded in two principles and 8 tenets, focusing on equity and social justice. Now, in 1978, Burns called for a revolution. He said, a revolution is a complete and pervasive transformation of an entire social system. And in 2003, in his book, Transforming Leadership, that was the title, he said, transformation is a metamorphosis, a deep, sustainable, lasting change, right? As when a frog is transformed into a prince, he says, or a carriage maker into an auto factory. And in 2003, he also said that the outcomes of of leadership should be a revolution, but a specific kind of revolution, one that requires a complete and pervasive transformation of the conditions that leave billions of the world's people in the direst want. And so I think what Burns was talking about wasn't transformational leadership, wasn't just processes that go in any particular direction, but transformative leadership, which really does focus on equity and redressing the conditions of the people in the direst want. And because he focuses on transformation as being different from change, we can move the chairs around in the room and put them back exactly the way they were. That's change. But transformation is more sustainable, it's more permanent, and it's why I use the image of metamorphosis to represent it. Once a butterfly emerges from a chrysalis and a caterpillar, it's pretty hard to go back to being a caterpillar. There's a lot of support, theoretically, for new leadership approaches. We all know Freire called for reading the world as well as the word. Oakes and Rogers talk about technical knowledge being insufficient to bring about equity. Nickel wants truly transformative changes. And scholars from Bolivia, who also write about transformative leadership, talk about the need for new mental models and worldviews. Specifically, there are a number of writers who also call for transformative leadership, specifically as the direction that leadership should take. I have to draw your attention to the 2013 quote by Van Ord, who recognized my work, much to my surprise when I found it. Recognized the conceptual murkiness between transformational and transformative leadership, he said, scholars such as Shields have successfully endeavored, I like that adverb, to define and theorize transformative leadership as distinctively separate. And so I describe transformative leadership as leadership that begins with questions of justice and democracy, critiquing inequitable practices, and offering the promise not only of individual achievement, but of a better life lived in common with others. And as I've said, there are 2 basic hypotheses and 8 tenets that I'll spend just a few minutes on very quickly. The first hypothesis is that sense that if a student, whether you're talking about kindergarten or doctoral, is worried about something that's going on at home, worried about being teased for being transgender or gay, worried about whether there's going to be food on the table at night or a place to sleep, or if you're a Latino, whether ICE has arrested a parent or a relative while you're in class, it's pretty hard to concentrate on learning. And so the hypothesis is that the creation of a safe, inclusive, respectful space in which students can focus on learning promotes the success of all students. You have better distal outcomes if you create a safe environment for learning. And the second one is that we've spent a lot of time in education recently focusing on individual benefits, what's often known as private good. And so we talk about how you need to go to university because you'll have a better lifetime salary. We forget to tell African Americans that's not true for them. And so the second hypothesis is that if we focus on both individual and public good, if we balance the individual and the collective, then we promote a stronger democratic society. And to do that, an educational leader or a transformative leader needs to engage these 8 tenets, which I will talk about very quickly in turn. I need to, first of all, say, I do this to remind you that transformative leadership is not my theory. It's a theory that's been talked about since '86, since '91 with Ponce, Rogers, and Datley. Other people have written about aspects of it. But what I've tried to do, and what Van Ord said I had done, was to theorize it and articulate it and bring it together as a theory. So for each of these tenets, I'm going to show you at least one person that's talked about the idea and tell you a little bit about what I think it means. So Furman talked about how leaders need to develop a sense of oppression, exclusion, and marginalization. And to do that, you need to know yourself, your community, your institutional context. You need to look at the data. And if you decide that there are no inequities, forget being a transformative leader. It's too much work. But if you find that there are inequities that must be addressed, as you ask yourself what kind of change is required, then this notion of accepting a mandate, committing to it, being absolutely dedicated to redressing the inequities becomes the first step. They're not sequential, they're all interactive. We need all of these tenets at once. So I wouldn't say that tenet 2 is the most important, but it's the one that we tend to skip over because it's the hardest, and we can't do that. So Johnson, way back in 2008, found this in his research, that what separates successful leaders from unsuccessful ones is their mental models or meaning structures, not their knowledge, information, training, or experience per se. And he goes on to say that many of us who train leaders in universities forget that. I love this poster, don't believe everything you think. Because we've been taught to think things that are inappropriate and incorrect sometimes. And so what leaders have to do is engage in the hard work of deconstructing these ideas and many others. Ideas about deficit thinking, implicit bias, stereotype threat, racism, sexism, xenophobia, hate, homophobia, etc., etc. And if we don't hold those conversations and teach members of our organization to address these ideas, change is not going to be sustainable. It will simply be tinkering. The third tenet has to do with power distribution. We all have power as leaders, and we need to recognize that, but we need to distribute it more equally. And to do that means that we need to examine decision-making, policies, and practices wherever we are by asking questions like who benefits and who's disadvantaged, who's included and who's excluded, and who's marginalized and who's valued, and whose voices have been heard and whose have been silenced as we've gone about making this decision or developing this policy. The fourth one has to do with this balance of public and private good that I've talked about before. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but if we focus too much on the individual and forget the notion of public good, Then we end up with things like zero tolerance, excessive suspensions and expulsions of black and brown kids, because we blame them for their behavior and not necessarily the societal attitudes in which the behavior is embedded. Increase of private and charter schools, again blaming schools, focus on tests, etc., etc. Once you've paid attention to those four, you better begin to think about curriculum, what happens in the classroom, pedagogy as well. And so we need to focus on democracy, equity, emancipation, and justice, which requires dialogue and the creation of inclusive spaces. No teacher can know something about the cultures and the backgrounds of every student in a class. And if you try to teach that, you're going to be essentializing and incorrect often. But you can create space in which the student can be the expert on their experience and their background. And to do that, we need dialogue. And I love Freire's comment, where he says, dialogue is a relationship between two subjects, and every time the thou is changed into an it, then education becomes deformation. Grummett says that curriculum isn't the text or the standard or the material, but it's the conversation that makes sense of things. We have to have a conversation, create spaces for every student to bring their lived reality into the learning space. And part of this is also Bakhtin's notion of carnival. Walter mentioned that I had done some work on Bakhtin. He talks about medieval carnival in which princes and paupers came together in public square wearing costumes and masks, and they didn't know who they were talking to or who they were rubbing shoulders with. And thus in carnival, Bakhtin says, what's suspended first is hierarchical structure. All distance between people, and people who in life are separated by hierarchies enter into free and familiar contact. And how can we do that in organizations? How can we at least sometimes overcome the hierarchies and the barriers? The sixth tenet has to do with the notion of interdependence, interconnectedness, global awareness. We need to understand, and we need to help students understand at every level that what happens here affects people in other parts of the world, and what happens in other parts of the world affects us here. We need to balance critique with promise. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to do a reasoned critique. Jackson talks about transformative optimism. I like that phrase. And critique, of course, is not just criticism. It is reasoned argument. But I use the word promise. Some scholars use the word possibility. Uh-oh, we need to lose Monty as well. For a dissertation defense, I know. The word promise is a verb and a noun and an adjective, and it implies action. And Van Ord, to go back to him, says transformative leadership is characterized by its activist agenda, a term that Walter used when he was describing me at the beginning. The eighth tenet is the need to exhibit moral courage. If we do all of those other things, we better have some moral courage. And that means, as Wiener says, leaders are often pretty schizophrenic if you're going to be a transformative leader, because you gain your position because you've worked well within the status quo. People have recognized you for what you've done, and yet you need to have a foot in the camp of exercising oppositional power and knowing when to resist. And I want to conclude by telling you the story of a truly transformative leader. Zara Fezahat is the founder of a school called Rawal School, located in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. You can Google it. There are articles on the web about Rawal School. She was educated at the University of Toronto, has a master's in international affairs, was back in Pakistan, fairly well-to-do, wealthy woman, looked out her window one day and she saw kids scrounging in the garbage can behind her house. And she asked somebody, probably a servant, what the kids were doing. And the answer was, they're looking for cobs that still have kernels of corn on them because they're hungry. And she said to the person, tell them if they let me teach them, I'll feed them. The kids ran away because they thought she was lying and that she'd beat them. But gradually, because they were hungry, they came back. And they said, would you really teach us? Would you really feed us? And so she spread these mats out that you can see behind her house and educated in Pakistan, where it's not allowed, boys and girls together, Christians and Muslims together. I happened to visit the school in December one year when they were having an Eid/Christmas celebration that the kids had put together. And the kids were doing skits, and they sang Christmas carols, and they did traditional Pakistani dances, and they talked in Urdu, and they talked in English. And when you talk to Zara, she says that all of the teaching is, at the time, it's not anymore, they've got somebody's donated a building, was volunteer. And she had to go to merchants to get them to donate fabric for uniforms. And she couldn't take money from the government because they would require her to keep the boys and girls separate and not to take Christians and Muslims together, right? So the courage that she exhibited in order to educate these street kids is, I think, a real lesson to all of us. So back in 1977, Bourdieu, whom we all know about talking about social reproduction, also talked about what social scientists need to do and be. And he said we need to show how mechanisms of domination reproduce social inequities. True, but we need to do more than show it. We need to address it. And Moeller from Norway talks about democratic leadership and talks about how we need to show that education can have an important role in attaining a deeply democratic society. And so my argument is that in order for education to fulfill that role, we need an image of democracy in which people live together in mutual benefit and equity and inclusion. And that requires a value-based vision of the kind of society we want, and hence a normative theory of leadership to bring it about. Thank you.
Questions, responses? Walk you speechless?
Oh, good, I can say more. No, go ahead.
I'm just curious, you're talking about making essentially, making educators to think of the goal of what kind of society they want to reproduce when they teach. That's
Not to reproduce necessarily, but to create, yes. Sorry, carry on.
Well, I'm just thinking that, in a way, I mean, the whole idea of an educational institution is to transform and to reproduce the society you want, right? I mean, so why haven't educators thought of that? Why, if they're studying what is in school, why did they throw the norms out? Why did they just think it was pie in the sky? Or was it that the idea of actually thinking about goals would be silly? I don't get that.
You know, in many ways, I don't either. I remember asking a group of master's students in leadership one year if they'd ever talked in their teacher education programs about the goals and purposes of education, and they all said they hadn't. And it seems to me that if we at universities don't help them to think about the goals of education, we're failing, which I think helps to account for the failure of, the general failure, I would argue, of education today. I think partly it's because we've had such an emphasis on individualism, on the profit motive, on efficiency and effectiveness influenced by scientific management, that we haven't recognized the need for equity. And Oakes and Rogers would say, even if we've recognized it, those of us in power don't necessarily want to give up our power and privilege in order to attain it. So I think the answer is fairly complex, but we have to recognize that with privilege comes responsibility, and we better start doing something about it. At least, again, that's my argument. I was just rereading this morning as I was preparing something else, a book that's written by a couple of colleagues, a man from Finland and a couple of American scholars who are arguing for what they call a non-affirmative theory of educational leadership. And they argue that if we have a values-based theory, then education becomes brainwashing. And I think the error in their argument is that they talk about current theories being both prescriptive and normative. And I think coupling those two terms is what's problematic, because I don't see that there's anything recipe-like in what I've shared with you today. I haven't said you do this and you do this and you do this, and it's a best practice for all contexts, and every leader has to do the same thing in the same way. You know, what I have said is, here are some principles. Think about how you need to apply them in your context, so that if I were looking at transformative leadership in South Africa, for example, I might be focusing much more on gender. Here in Detroit, I don't think you can be a transformative leader without focusing on race. I think if I were in rural America, I might be focusing on issues of poverty. So I think there are some principles that transformative leadership introduces, but it's not a prescription as to how leaders should act. And I think part of the issue with those people who say, no, we don't want a normative theory because it becomes brainwashing if you tell people what they have to believe, is that they think of it as a prescription instead of just a guide.
I have two questions. It's a question I'm still forming, but my first question is, what if the normative values, and there's less consensus about what the norm is in society as a whole? So I'm from the political science department, not from the educational field. So my question is, if there's like instability about what the norm should be in society, how do we know what the norms, what ought to be in classroom discussion? That's my first question. My second question is, you mentioned that this is not a prescription for transformative leadership, but then again, I'm wondering, how do we ensure that such leaders are accepted by the followers?
That's the harder one.
Because if there are people who are who have this inborn like nature to become like natural leaders, who has the charisma to be accepted by the followers, so I'm just wondering, like, how do you become a transformative leader? And then your followers will follow.
Whoa, you've got a whole lot of questions there.
So those are my two questions.
What was the first one? I think scholars who've researched values like Rushmore Kidder and people like that have said that there are some universal values that pretty well everybody in every culture and every occupation will prioritize. And there are things like acting morally, or even equality, or things like that. The issue isn't with the value, because there are very few people who would say, no, we want to have social injustice, right? It's with the definition. And that's why I think this notion of dialogue becomes so important, because we have to talk through what do we mean and see if we can reach some sort of consensus. There's a scholar named Hodgkinson who talks about values hierarchy, and he says there are three different kinds of values. And the first one he says is just preferences. If I like chocolate ice cream and you like vanilla ice cream, we're not going to argue over it or come to blows. We're fine. The type 2 values he talks about are consensus and consequences, and we can probably identify the consequences of a policy even if it takes a while, like the justice reform from the 90s, right, that is being so soundly critiqued today. The third type he talks about is the values that are religious, that come from beliefs that are entrenched and we can't shake. And what he would argue, I think, is that if you move those type 3 values, the commitments, down into the consequences and the consensus, then you have a chance to reach an agreement. So if I'm, opposed to abortion, and you think it should be all right, especially in cases of rape or something, I'm not going to give up my belief, and you probably aren't either. But if we can move it down and say, well, what are the consequences for a woman of having an abortion, of not being able to have an abortion, we might be able to find some agreement there. So we need to learn some techniques for defusing those values conflicts that are type 3 values if we're going to reach agreement in an organization. I don't think this is something that you can do alone. I mean, you can try, but it needs to build support. You need allies. It takes all of us. I know in some of my classes, I remember a few years ago, one of my African American students said in class, African Americans are prejudiced too, or can be prejudiced too. Last night we were talking in class, reading something where the statement was, everybody has the potential to be biased. Everybody is biased. I can't say that. I could never say in a class or to a group of, a mixed group of people, African Americans are biased too. But because she was black, she could say it. And there are many things that I can say that she couldn't say because she'd be called an angry black woman, right? And yet I can say them and get away with it. And so I think what that says to me is that we need to build allegiances and allies and work together to accomplish it. That's the only way I know of, and it's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but it's a start.
Do you have any success stories to report? A group of people who are practicing this transformative theory and implementing it in the school, and with results that you can share with us.
Oh, that was my last presentation for the Humanities Center, and I don't know if I can find it, but I'd love to be able to show it to you. I have a number of exemplars of school principals who've exercised transformative leadership, and one that I write about, who I use the pseudonym for, is Catherine Lake. And she started off implementing transformative leadership, and her school had gone from being about 80% white to 50% white. So a tremendous increase of African